Welcome to the Inside Syracuse Basketball Podcast. I'm Mike Waters. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Pete Thamel, college sports reporter for Yahoo Sports. Pete is a Syracuse graduate and a former colleague of mine at the Post-Standard. Pete and I talked about the recent retirement announcements of North Carolina's Roy Williams and Duke's Mike Krzyzewski. And we also discussed how long Jim Boeheim will keep coaching and how Syracuse eventually goes about replacing the legend. Pete, how are you doing?
Mike, I'm great. It's a pleasure to be here. Longtime listener, first time guest. So I'm excited to be on.
Well, this works out.
I know more
great.
of my college friends are going to listen to me on this than anything else I do say or write this year. So
you say that, but I don't know. You're pretty well read, and we're still building our audience. So you're going to help us there with all your former college buddies. There you go.
Yeah. No.
So thank you very much. But no, you're the perfect guy because you cover college sports for a long, long time. So you kind of know a little bit about the Duke and the UNC landscapes. Well, obviously, at some point in this conversation, we're going to tie in the whole Syracuse and Jim Boeheim dynamic here.
Sure.
And of course, as a Syracuse University grad and a guy who used to cover the Syracuse program by my side for several years at the Post-Standard, this is great. So let's start with Coach K and Roy Williams. Now, we knew that the ACC had several coaches over the age of 70, and eventually these guys are going to start calling it a career.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2 months, Roy Williams and Mike Krzyzewski both go ahead and call it quits, basically. I mean, did you ever think we'd see these two guys stepping aside basically at the same time?
Well, it's interesting. Typically, in the years I've done this, college football, college basketball, when you see legends step aside, it comes parallel to poor performance on the field or on the court. And quite frankly, UNC hasn't been UNC the past couple of years, especially 2 years ago. And last year, they were a pedestrian version of themselves. As a North Carolina graduate, I'm sure you've seen plenty of editions of UNC that were better. Duke was generationally bad last year. So again, is this the only reason? Of course not, right? These are older guys. Both of them had serious health problems. So there's not a surprise. But in terms of nudging to the transition, it is so rare when someone has won big, in my experience covering college sports, and then said, you know what, now is the time. It just hasn't happened. So I think what's been lost in this a little bit with all of the coverage of Roy and all the coverage of Mike is that this is, their programs have shown little bits of vulnerability that maybe hadn't been there much in the past, decade or so. Again, they're not doing bad jobs. No one was going to run them out, but you see your own mortality when you see the product being diminished from the standard you set. And certainly they're brilliant coaches, but I really do think that if Duke was Duke last year and a number one seed, it's a harder decision to make. Now, of course, Mike's not going to say that. I saw his comments yesterday, and Roy, I thought, was pretty candid. He said he couldn't do it like he was doing it before. And I give him a lot of credit for that, because we've seen guys go out kicking and screaming when the product has been diminished. So now that said, Duke is going to be excellent this year. Banchero is the most talented player in college basketball, in my opinion. And they've got it's not the Zion Reddish Barrett class, but they have a class that's at least in the conversation. They have 3 top 20 guys. They have a decent core returning. They will be, I would think, the ACC's most talented team. There's still transfers that have to spin back and forth. Florida State's going to be really good again, right? Right. But I would think that Banchero is a rare dude, right? A top 3, no-brainer, big time guy. And so I think you start with him. You put Keels in there. Is it AJ Griffin, the kid from New York? So you are going to see a Duke that resembles the Duke you remember, not the sort of sputtering Duke of the Jalen Johnson defection and just sort of uninspired play of the last year. So it'd be good. I think that's the best story in college basketball for the next year is, can Mike Krzyzewski win the ACC, which they haven't done since 2010. They shared it with Maryland. It was that long ago. Maryland was still in the league. Can Duke win the ACC? Can Mike Krzyzewski go out as the, NCAA champion, a Final Four coach one more time for the 13th time. I think that will be the biggest, most compelling storyline in the sport moving forward next season. That's gonna be a lot of fun for everybody. I mean, the schedule's not out yet, right, Mike?
No, not out. No.
Yeah. So if Duke comes to Carrier Dome and it's Coach K's last game, that's an event. Duke comes to Boston College. I live in Boston. That it is going to be as distinctive a farewell tour and celebrated a farewell tour as we've ever seen in the sport. Now, some people have criticized K, saying like he wanted the attention. I don't really believe that. I think you give either. John Shire the year to establish himself, get to know recruits. You have a very specific vision to pitch to. I think that gives them an advantage, and he gets to go hire a great assistant coach to add to the staff, which they need. I mean, we have no idea how much money John Shire is going to make, but it's not going to be $8 million, right? So it's probably going to be somewhere around a third to a quarter of that. So if you look at how Duke is going to be composed, the staff is going to be key. I don't think Carolina has a very good staff right now. They're certainly not a staff that's going to scare anyone in the ACC. So if you're John Shire, maybe you go outside the family and you bring in a killer assistant and you pay the guy $900,000. I think it just gives you a little time to develop a plan, develop an identity. Carolina just went and like grabbed the first guy in a powder blue polo shirt, and Jeff Lebo, who's fine, but like Jeff Lebo's not scaring anybody in the ACC. So I really think that Duke has an advantage going forward with that.
All right, you kind of led me into my next question here. Carolina is now in the post-Roy era immediately with Hubert Davis. Duke's got 1 year left with Mike Krzyzewski as the head coach, and then John Shire takes over after next season. Which school, which program do you think is better situated right now as it moves forward to have success in the future?
It's a good question. I said this on our Yahoo Sports podcast yesterday. One of these guys is going to fail. One of them will. I'm not sure which one, but one of them will. I mean, they're following huge legends. They have no head coaching experience, and the expectations are one of them has to follow the greatest coach of a generation. The other has to follow a guy who won 3 national titles. All right. So the expectations are just completely out of whack. So it's without knowing what Shire's staff is going to be like, without really knowing what the roster is going to be like. I mean, he has a clean slate in 22. I think only 3 of the top 20 kids in 2022 have committed, right?
So right. Yeah, very few because of COVID.
Yes, it's not like you're coming in and you're scrambling. You can go in and say, hey, you are going to become the face of New Duke, which could be a really attractive pitch. I mean, look, they're both awesome schools, right? They both have awesome tradition, awesome fan bases. They are 2 of the 5 best jobs in the country, if quite frankly, not the 2 best, Mike. I mean, these are awesome places where everything is set up to win. Duke especially has done a great job with facilities, branding, really like the marketing, social media push. They've really, I think, have an edge there. They've done as good of a job as anyone in college athletics with that ancillary stuff that matters probably more than it should, right? Yeah. But these are both great brands. Kids want to play there. Their flagship Nike, like everything lines up for things to work for them. The problems for John and Hubert are going to be to win at the levels where their fan bases have become accustomed to. And there's probably, I don't know how long the leash will be. It was interesting to see yesterday. Did you watch the press conference?
Oh, yes.
So Kay, gave the tribute to Tom Butters.
He should.
Yes. No, he should. No, Tom Butters saved his, Coach K's just another Bob Bender. If it's, just some guy who sort of sputtered through and was a forgettable couple-year coach. And so this is my theory. And I wrote a column about this on Yahoo. Like Coach Duke was very good before Coach K. They'd gone to the Final Four a handful of times. They had Mike Jaminski and Spanarkel, and they were a very good basketball program. Yeah. But they weren't Duke like we know Duke, a relentless winner, a multi-time national champion, they've 12 Final Fours in K's time there. Like they were a prominent figure on the landscape. K turned them into the definitive program of a generation. And so how much will Duke be able to carry John Shire in the early years? Just like how much will Carolina, which has been that program for many generations, for almost a century, right? Carolina's been a relentless winner. So how much can Carolina and the brand help Hubert adjust? I think those are the interesting questions for me. Were kids going for K, or were they going for Cameron and the education? So, were kids going to UNC for, and look, it's an awesome education school too. Like, they both are the easiest sells in college basketball. So I think it's going to come to, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think it's going to come down to how they can recruit and pitch themselves to the next generation of player. They're both going to be competing with the G League. They're both going to be competing with overtime elite. And your sophistication in navigating those complicated recruitments is really going to be an important way of how to push forward.
So let's start talking a little bit about Syracuse. Let's bring Syracuse into this overall picture, because Roy steps aside, Mike's going to step aside in another year, and then you have Jim, who's older than both. He's got no signs of slowing down or wanting to call it quits. In an interview just yesterday with your friend, my colleague Donna Totoda, Boeheim, he says he's not only coaching next year, he's coaching the year after. The kids that he's recruiting, and they're going after a lot of kids in this class, the class of 22. He plans on coaching them, because otherwise, it's the reason Mike Krzyzewski says he didn't want to go out and recruit this year, knowing that he wasn't going to coach these kids. So
yeah, well, Jim Boeheim was never going to go out quietly, Mike, right? I mean, that's just not his personality, right? He was never the guy that was going to win the national title and walk away. He's a fighter. It's that school, that program is his identity. And I think, getting inside Jim's head a little bit, like, he's nervous about what happens after he does transition out. And so, I mean, look, when I was in school, people were talking about who was going to replace Boeheim. And I graduated in 1999. So, and he was one of those coaches who was like, oh, I won't be doing this when I'm X years old. But they all end up doing it. They're all junkies. They can't get enough. They can't go. I really think that it's going to be fascinating. I think they have the guy on the bench there to replace him, Major and Autry. Like, I wouldn't be surprised whenever this transition does happen, if Red, John Shire, and Hubert are kind of the young guys. And look, Coach Larinaga at Miami doesn't have a lot of time left either. Just when you look at age and you look at recent performance. So the ACC is going to change exponentially quickly. But obviously, this is a Syracuse podcast. It would be the storybook ending if Jim and his two sons, have a great season, make a run in the tournament, and then he goes off into the sunset. They've clearly had some roster management problems recently. The talent in the Syracuse basketball program right now is a shadow of what it was a decade ago, when they had that really good run. I think of that Arenze Onuaku team that lost to Butler in the Elite Eight when he hurt himself in the Big East tournament against Georgetown. Like, that was like the centerpiece of a run. Deion Waiters coming off the bench, right? I mean, they were good, talented. They had the right mix of the occasional one and done, two and done guy with really good 3 and 4 year guys. The Brandon Trishes of the world, who were just awesome college players, came in, developed, won a lot of games. Syracuse was always in a contention for a 5-7 year stretch, and for a 1, 2, or a 3 seed. Whether it was the end of the Big East or the early ACC, they were in contention for the conference title. I mean, Syracuse has been a mediocre program in ACC play for the past 5-7 years. I mean, it just hasn't been what it was. And how much
about it? We've recorded all these numbers and the trends, and you're right. And there's a lot of factors going on there. In a weird way, it might actually help the Boeheim successor, that like we were talking about expectations of Duke fans and Carolina fans. I think Syracuse fans might realize, listen, this isn't easy. It's not a given that Syracuse, even with Jim Boeheim at the helm, is always going to be knocking down 30-win seasons and be a contender. That this is not necessarily an easy job. It's a tough job.
Yeah.
You mentioned a name, Boeheim's successor, Red Autry. Before we get to that question, though, the fact that a few years back, when Mike Hopkins was going to be the successor, and Syracuse University had actually said so, they had made it official, Mike Hopkins was going to succeed Jim Boeheim. And I remember there was a few naysayers around town. They're like, oh, we love Hop, but he doesn't have any head coaching experience. No head coaching experience. Why can't we, why can't we go hire Jay Wright or somebody? The fact that North Carolina and Duke have now both gone in-house with assistants with no head coaching experience, does that kind of make it okay for Syracuse and other programs to even big programs like Syracuse to go in-house, no experience?
I think it certainly helps. And I don't think there are a lot of established head coaches who want to come in and replace Jim Boeheim. Like I remember, going into his earlier transition that ended up not happening. The university was like, "Oh, forget those pesky NCAA sections. We'll just let you come back." I had called. It was kind of that era when like Archie Miller was the hot guy and Chris Mack was kind of the hot mid-major guy. And I called around some, and like there was no appetite for high-end mid-major coaches to come into Syracuse and replace Jim Boeheim. Jim Boeheim has made Syracuse what it is, even more so than Mike Krzyzewski has made Duke what it is. Duke had a better pedigree before K got there than Syracuse had before Boeheim got there, and there really is, if you think about it, no good reason for Syracuse University to be great at basketball. There's not a lot of local talent, right? There's one player every 5 years, maybe, up in that area, maybe a little more recently, but like, an all league type player, maybe once every 5 years, maybe. There was Lazarus Sims and then a big drought, from 90s on. And then there's been your odd Trish and who was the big fellow who never panned out?
Dajuan Coleman, but
Dajuan Coleman,
he was very good, but his knees betrayed him.
Yes, he was certainly a talented guy. But those guys are there. The years where there aren't players of that level are more often than the years where there are, compared to Atlanta or DC, where there's just there's 5 kids at Paulus Sixth that are better usually most years than the best kid in Syracuse. So the point is, Jim Boeheim created something out of now there's passion. The dome helped, Pearl helped. There's all the reasons why it happened are very logical. But from a pure baseline reason, when coaches look at that job, they're like, wait a minute, the expectations are through the roof. There's no local talent. It's not a place where like kids grow up in New York and in the Northeast wanting to play for Syracuse. That is true, but it doesn't have the national allure of a Carolina, of a Duke, like a place like Texas. Climate is going to be a factor. When you're like a national recruit looking at, like, and again, I this is not to knock Syracuse, but like when you go 30,000 feet and look at it there, it is the highest compliment to Jim Boeheim, because you're like, wow, you did it there where there wasn't a lot of organic reasons for it to happen there. Like, Georgia football should always be good, right? Alabama football should always be good. It's all around them. He basically turned Syracuse into a destination which did not have a logical exit on the highway. And so I give him credit for that, but that is going to scare coaches away because that. And it is a place that has honored its own. When you look at Syracuse, it is a place, if you look at Jim Boeheim's staff, there's a certain DNA and a certain understanding. It's a quirky place. And nobody has sold recruits better on Syracuse in the last decade than Red Autry. He's super wired in DC. He has a great relationship with Keith Stevens, who's the most powerful guy in basketball in that area. He's from New York, where he has consistently been able to go in and navigate complicated recruitments and bring good players. So I really think it's easy for me to see him as the next face because he's done the work already.
Now, listen, I cover the program. I could answer this myself, but you're my podcast guest, and my podcast listeners are going to never listen again if I don't ask you, well, what about Jerry McNamara, Pete?
Sure. Jerry McNamara has done an excellent job, and he's probably a pinch more of an iconic player. There's a romanticism to Jerry McNamara from playing, being the star freshman on that title team. And, obviously was a prolific 4-year player, face of the program, all the buses coming from Scranton, the whole thing. I just think if you look at it from who has been a better, if you pulled the ACC coaches and said, who's a better assistant coach, and Adrian Autry would be the answer.
Well, the one thing you do have out there is for the past several years, Adrian Autry has also had the title of associate head coach. And I don't know if that means anything to the folks that will end up making this decision, but it's something else that it says something about Red, I think. If you're John Wildhack, when Jim Boeheim comes to you and says, okay, I am done. If you're John, do you have to call Mike Hopkins first, or is the last couple years out in Washington kind of making you go, you know what, we're good here. We'll hire one of the guys off the current staff.
Yeah, I'd be curious, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, Mike, if contractually that's even possible. Because if you're Washington and Mike Hopkins starts the way he started, you are going to obviously know that Syracuse could make a run at him someday. Because Jim Boeheim can't go forever. He may want to, but he can't go forever. So I believe Hop won Pac-12 Coach of the Year back-to-back years when he started. Gave him a great adrenaline shot his first year. Went to the NCAA tournament, won a game his second year, and then has significantly backslid since then. There's no way to sugarcoat that. But he got an extension after that second year. And I know to fire Mike Hopkins right now is very expensive. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $9-10 million. It's a lot of money. And I can't imagine they would give him that kind of guarantee and not protect him the other way. Right. That would be administrative malfeasance, and Washington's too smart to do that. So I think certainly they could call. I mean, you would at least have to, for the optics of it, but and Mike's done a good job. He's very happy out there too. I mean, you know Mike and talk to him. I mean, it's a great city. Seattle is a much better basketball city and basketball area. If you look, I mean, we could rattle off.
It's very underrated.
Oh, it's super underrated. I mean, it's you can go all the way back. There are a lot of talented Hall of Fame type players who've come from the city of Seattle. If you recruit Seattle in a prolific manner, you can win a national title. I think that you can't do it every year, but you can build a consistent Final Four roster if you can mine that city in a proper. I mean, Paulo Banchero's from Seattle. His mom's one of the all-time leading scorers at University of Washington. So there are great elite players there. I mean, you look at some of Arizona's better rosters; they've done great in Seattle. Whoever is really dominating the Pac-12 has always had to have a toe in Seattle. And been able to pull some players from there. And Lorenzo Romar had some great teams there. I mean, some great teams with great players. You think about Brandon Roy, Martell Webster's from Seattle. I mean, Jamal Crawford's from Seattle. We could go on and on. And there'd be five we forgot who were really good NBA mainstays.
Where do you think the Syracuse program goes in the years after Jim Boeheim retires? It's a version of the question: how well situated is this program for future success when the guy who's iconic and synonymous with the program leaves?
I think they will be fine, right? I think the last 5-7 years have probably been more realistic to what Syracuse is going to be in the national scene than maybe that previous run we were talking about when they were dominant, a 1 seed, a 2 seed, and we're making deep runs in the NCAA tournament. They'll be a very good ACC program that will be competitive in the league and can occasionally jump up and really compete at the highest level in the ACC, which means you're competing at the highest level in the sport. You can be a top 25 program that moonlights when things fall right as a top 10 program. The name, image, and likeness, I think, will help a place like Syracuse. That's an insular city that loves their teams and loves their sports. And you're going to have car dealerships, restaurants, all those types of things. That's going to be more helpful for Syracuse basketball players in Syracuse than Georgia Tech basketball players in Atlanta, per se.
Right. I get it.
So I think if you take advantage of that, and then the transfer portal Syracuse has done pretty well in the transfer portal because guys know exactly what they're walking into. They're going to walk into full arenas. They're going to walk into a program that has a very defined style. And if you want to jump up, it's a really attractive place. If you're a mid-major player, then you want to go. If you're at another high major, you're playing in the ACC, you're playing in front of a full house. You're in a major market just in terms of you're sort of enveloped into New York some. They have not surprisingly done well in the transfer portal because it's an attractive destination to play college basketball. So I think Syracuse is well situated. The Mello Center isn't one of the 10 best facilities in the country, but it's totally fine. It's a very nice place. Nobody's going to go to the Mello Center and be I don't want to play there. So is it a waterfall cascading kind of crazy facility Oregon or Alabama football? No, but it's a plus. That is definitely a recruiting advantage for Syracuse that they have that. So it's, the bones are there. The dome is still a major attraction. Guys want to play in front of big crowds. I remember writing the story for the Post-Standard about Carmelo Anthony going to visit the Carrier Dome. Troy Weaver walks him in and he looks around and he's just like, I want to play here. Like, this is awesome. Like, this is, that environment still matters. And college basketball really matters in Syracuse, New York. And I think players feel that and sense that. So I think it will be fine. And look, it's ultimately going to come down to what always is going to come down to. How well do you recruit the 95 quarter? How well do you recruit New York, New Jersey, Philly, and DC? And the best Syracuse teams have dominated that corridor and been able to identify and then develop talent from that area.
All right. One last question. Whenever Jim decides that it is time, and this could be several years down the road, let's not say when, but how? Will he do it like Roy Williams did after a season's over, take a few more weeks on April 1st, throw everybody a big April Fool's joke and say, okay, I'm done? Do you do it like Mike Krzyzewski just did, where he's like, okay, guys, I'm going to be done, but I'm going to take one more year because I want to give my top assistant a chance to really get his legs underneath him. And, I'll steer the program through the next year, but everybody knows it's my last. Or does he do it like Dean Smith, where Dean Smith surprised everybody retiring just before the start of fall practice and kind of, made sure that the guy he wanted from his staff, in this case, it was Bill Guthridge, he wanted Bill Guthridge to have a shot at the job. And he walked away right before the start of the season. School had no other choice. Is it Roy's way, Kay's way, or Dean's way for Jim Boeheim?
It's a really good question. For the sake of the program, the K way is probably the best way.
Yeah, I like it
because the Roy way, you leave yourself vulnerable to get your roster paired. The Dean way would certainly work, but Jim Boeheim's going to coach that last year. That's just not his DNA. He's not a walk away guy, right? He is a fighter. He has always been that way. And I've never seen the ending being clean and tidy with Jim Boeheim. That's just not who he is. I hope he gets to end it in a way he finds satisfying. He certainly earned that. He certainly earned a voice in who's next. Like, he has done that university and that program very right. There's certainly been bumps in the road, but Jim Boeheim has been the most transformative figure in the history of Syracuse University. And I don't think anyone can argue that. What he's done, especially for the institution and elevating the name and the brand, it's really incalculable how he's done that. So that said, I don't see him as the kind of guy who wants the rocking chair tour, right? That's not his DNA. He doesn't like attention. He doesn't want to go into these cities where they booed him and cursed at him for years and have like people cheering at him. That's just a little bit. It wouldn't surprise me if it's just like one day he just decides to hang it up. Now, how and when and the strategy behind that, I don't know. The last time there was a transition planned, Jim Boeheim didn't talk about it a whole lot. He didn't like to talk about it. He didn't talk about it publicly. He didn't talk about it with the staff. Like, it was just kind of like, he's a show up, do your job, keep your head down kind of guy. Like, that's long-term strategic thinking is not really his MO. So I think there is what the question you asked is a great question. Because if you want to set the program up successfully, I think there does have to be some sort of defined and refined strategy here. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. The results of this year will be interesting. Obviously, he has his two sons on the team. It would seem like the logical swan song, but it doesn't surprise me that he told Donna that he's going to go longer, because that's just who he is and how he's wired. God bless him.
Yeah, I don't think the sentimental ride off into the sunset with your boys at either side. I think that's great for a lot of folks, and honestly, somebody like myself. I mean, I love that sentimental sort of crap.
Jim Boeheim is not a sentimental man. That is just not part of his DNA. Probably what's made him great, right?
Oh yeah, especially here.
Yes.
You talked about this area. Listen, this has been a great conversation, Pete, and we could probably go on for hours between you and I talking about Syracuse and basketball and the ACC. But I got to cut you loose so that you can go break more stories. You broke one before we started, and now you're probably going to go break another one. So, but it's great for me to see. I love having you on the podcast.
Yeah.
I don't know. We didn't make it totally clear. I hope people out there know that I've known you forever. I knew you were a student at SU. You worked at the Post Standard, and yours is a friendship I value very, very much. And
well, yours is a mentorship I value. Nobody's mentored more journalists from Syracuse than Mike Waters, generously and relentlessly. So I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. He's been the best Daily Orange sports editor that's never been in the office. So he's done a marvelous job being very patient with a lot of young, eager beaver journalists like myself. So I appreciate you, Mike. Always have. And it's great to be on. It's great that you started this podcast and it's growing. And can't wait to see what it becomes. I'm sure there's a robust market for it. And I'm excited to see it grow.
Well, thanks again, Pete. Good talking to you, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.